So this session is all about using custom domains in Azure. And really, you might wonder what is really a custom domain name. And so let's recap a little bit. So when you create an app service on Azure, like we did before, we saw that we have something like, for example, myappservice.azurewebsites.net. And that is the same also for Azure Functions. Now, if you have other services, other Azure services, for example, storage accounts, etc., then maybe you will have something different. But basically, this is not an address that you control. It's just assigned to you. Maybe you control only the first part, which is in that case my app service. And as a custom domain, it could be pretty much anything you want as long as it is available, of course. For example, in that case, we are going to use www.tailwindtraders.xyz. And so in this session, we are going to talk about basics of domain name services. Now, this is some generic information that is not just valid for Azure, but which is going to be valid for pretty much any system that you're going to work on. And then after that, we will concentrate on Azure with custom domains in Azure services. And those will be lots of demo. We are going to see how to set custom domain for app services, websites, but also for function application, for storage accounts. And then once you have the custom domain, a good idea is to secure it. And this is the HTTPS that you sometimes see. The S stands for secure. And this is done with something which is called TLS security certificate. And so we'll see how you can acquire one, how you can use one for those different services. Finally, we will do some load balancing because on Azure, we saw that you have different ways to scale up and down or to scale out and in, but you may also want to have multiple servers, for example, on different locations which are balancing the load, which are using the load. And that can be done with a service on Azure called the Azure Traffic Manager. It's not the only way that you can actually do a load balancing in Azure. We also have something called Front Door, and there are other options also, and so we will do a quick review about that at the end. So a lot of demos in this application. But first, let's talk about DNS and domain name servers or domain name services. And those have different parts. And maybe some of those abbreviations, you're going to have seen them already. For example, TLD, top level domain. Now, there are literally hundreds of those, okay? It can be .com, .org, .net. I remember in the early days of internet, you really had only a few TLDs like .com, .org, .net, and that was pretty much it. There was edu, also edu for education. And nowadays, you have really 100 more. For example, XYZ is a valid top-level domain, or .info, or .media, etc., really a lot. And don't forget that you also have top-level domains for countries, all right? For example, .ch, I'm located in Switzerland, and so that would be .ch, which is the abbreviation for Switzerland, or .fr, .it, etc. So that's quite interesting, and this is something that you don't control yourself. You go to a registrar, and then you say, all right, I want to buy a custom domain which ends in .com, so the top-level domain is .com. And then after that, if we dive a little bit deeper, we have what is called an A record. A stands for apex. Apex, the definition of apex means the top part of something, the highest part of something. And sometimes we refer to those as root domain or maybe a naked domain because there is no www in front or no mail in front or no whatever. Okay, so it's just basically, for example, in that case, tailwindtraders.xyz. And so this is going to be defined into the DNS system by assigning an IP address to that. So the traffic is going to be redirected to an IP address. And then after that, if you go again one lower, you have the CNAME record. CNAME stands for canonical name record. And that can be sometimes called a subdomain, for example, www or api.tailwindtraders.xyz. Or it can even be multi-level, for example, us.north.api.tailwindtraders.xyz. Now, what is going to happen here with the CNAME record is a redirection. So basically, the traffic which comes inside to www.tailwindtraders.xyz is going to be redirected to another DNS entry. In that case, for example, tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. So if we recap a little bit what is in a URL, this is a unique resource locator, and the idea here is that really every resource on the web has a unique address. All right, this is a uniform resource locator, And for example, this is an example here. And if we examine what we have here, we start with the protocol. The protocol in that case is HTTPS, so it tells you that it's a web address. It's a secure web address, but it could also be something else. Okay, a URL is not just for the web. For example, it could be mail to. It could be, back then in my days, we had NNTP, the news transfer protocol. Or maybe you have protocol, like custom protocols for Teams calls, for example, for Microsoft, etc., etc. And then after that, you have the .com, which is a top-level domain. We talked about that. We have the apex, all right? And then we have the CNAME, which is, in that case, www, but it could be literally anything you want. And then after that, in order to uniquely identify a resource on the web server, then you have a path. And the path can be something.html. It can be, in that case, page name, $1 equals 2, etc. So it's always different. And for each URL, you are going to expect a different response. And here, in that case, we also have a query string. Now, in certain URLs, you will also see additional parts, for example, a hashtag which is going to lead to a target on the page, etc. But really what we have here is what defines a unique resource locator from a server-side perspective, if you want. And this is where the domain name services are going to act on those parts, the CNAME, the apex, and the TLD. So of course, in order to set up a DNS, you need to verify that you own the domain. And why is it important? Well, because you want to prove that you actually own this address, because otherwise I could go and I could say, hey, I own Microsoft.com, please send me all the address, all the traffic that is going to Microsoft.com. And of course, you don't want that. So there are a few ways that you can do that, but really it's important to know that you cannot use a domain unless you verify it. And there are different verification methods. Here on Azure, we will see a validation using a TXT record, a text record. We will talk about that in a moment. But there are also other validation methods, which depends a little bit on the provider that you are using. So without further ado, we are going to dive into a demo. And here we are going to set a custom domain on an Azure App Service. So let's go into the dashboard. Here, as you can see, we have different components that we'll use for the demos in this session. For example, here we have an app service which is titled www-tailwindtraders.com, and we will use our custom domain www.tailwindtraders.xyz to point to this web application. We will also do the same with subdomains for functions and also for a storage account where the process is a little bit different, as you can see later. Then we have also two app services running in Central US and in Europe, and we will do some load balancing between those two. And all this is possible thanks to DNS. So this is where we are going to set up the DNS in this particular demo. So let's go into the DNS portal. And here we see that this DNS is set up for tailwindtraders.xyz. So first we are going to see that we already told our registrar, this is where we bought the domain name, that it has to point back to Azure to those 4 different values. We see that we have ns1, 2, 3, and 4 -05.azure-dns.com. So basically this is a redirection that the registrar is going to do for us and point all the traffic back to Azure. And in fact, if we go into a terminal and we do a host command, we see that for the public is already informed that this particular domain is pointing back to Azure. However, we haven't defined anything yet. And so if we go into a portal, into a website, and we try to open www.tailwindtraders.xyz, then this is going to fail because, of course, Microsoft Azure has not been informed about the redirection yet, and this is why we need to do some DNS settings yet. So let's go back into the DNS. And what we are going to do now is go first into our app service. And in the overview here in the dashboard, if we scroll down, we will see that we have a custom domain set up. And right now, as you can see, this is pointing to www-tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. So first of all, let's try to open this and see what is running at this address. You can see it's a very simple HTML-based application, all right, super simple, but it's just to kind of illustrate the point that this website is here and running. In reality, of course, we would have here an actual website. However, if we go to tailwindtraders.xyz, we don't don't have anything yet. All right, so let's go back to the app service. If we scroll down, we have custom domains. And then we can start by adding a custom domain to this app service. And here we are going to enter the custom domain www.tailwindtraders.xyz. So this is not an apex, all right? This is not an A name. This is going to be a canonical name, a C name, because of the www. Now, if we try to validate that, we see that the validation fails. It's because we have not proven that we own this domain like we discussed earlier. And here we have instructions. So we have this ASUID. This is App Service Unique ID. And we need to enter a new text record named ASUID.ww with this cryptic value that we just saw. So let's open another portal with the domain name services, and inside there we can go and set a new record set. The name of the record set is going to be asuid.www, and for the type we are going to choose a text record, and again ASUID is App Service Unique ID. And then if we were using another subdomain, for example functions.tailwindtrader.xyz, we would use asuid.functions. In that case we want www. So let's paste the values that we copied before, and then we are creating this record set. And so at this point we can go back to the instructions, and now we see that the other thing that we need to do is create something else, which is a CNAME, which is pointing to the www or the subdomain. So it's a little bit different from the text record that we had before. So let's go and copy this value. All right, we are going to go back to the domain name service, to the DNS portal. Let's add a new record set. And inside there, this time we type www again, and then the CNAME, which is going to point to www-tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. So it's a redirection. Now here I'm changing the TTL, which is a time to leave, to 1 second. It's because I want to bypass the cache as much as possible, especially for later for the load balancing demo. Now typically you would set this value to 1 day or 1 week, like this you have some caching, but here I really want every time that a request is sent, I want this to be evaluated so that we can test the load balancing later. All right, so now this is done, which means that we can go back into our validation. First of all, of course, we need to save the record. And now we see that we have those two values which have been defined. And now we can go back into the app service. Let's go back to the validate button. And this time, after a short wait, because it takes a little time to be propagated, so maybe I need to refresh a couple of times, but after a short wait, we will see that we have proven that we own this domain. And as you can see, we have the availability and we have the ownership. So now we can click on Add Custom Domain. This is going to bring us back into the app service portal. And after a short wait, if I go and refresh, you will see that now we have two custom domains. We have the original one, which is a default one, and then we have another one, which is a custom domain that we own, but it's not secure at this point. That's okay, we'll do that later. Let's go back to the overview. We can go back to the window where we tried to load our website. Let's refresh that. And now, after a short wait again, we should get the original page, but this time it is running with tailwindtraders.xyz. It is not secure, that's okay. This will be the point of the next demo. All right, so before we go into the next demo, I would like to talk about security because this is a super important topic. And here we can talk about the Transport Layer Security Certificate. This is TLS. Maybe sometimes you hear about TLS/SSL. SSL is really nothing else than an old version of TLS if you want, which is kind of obsolete. It still works. And so if you have a TLS certificate, it's actually also valid for SSL traffic. But here on Azure, we work with TLS certificate. And so it is an updated version of SSL, like I mentioned. And it's really a certificate that is used to encrypt web traffic, and not just web traffic, but really any traffic can be encrypted using TLS. But it is very often used for web traffic when you have this HTTPS protocol, the S standing for secure. And there are multiple considerations or multiple ways that you can use a certificate into a custom domain. For example, you can bring your own certification if you already have one, and we'll see a demo about that. You can buy those certificates, for example, to a registrar, or you can have some issued to you, or you can buy a certificate or build a certificate directly in Azure, and this is valid for certain services. This certificate could also be used and stored into Azure Key Vault. So you remember Azure Key Vault, we saw that for secrets, and I told you it's not just for secrets and connection strings, etc., but it can also be used for certificates, and this is here an example that you can have. Storing the certificate in Key Vault could be very interesting because it's going to make updating the certificate much easier, and this is really something you want to avoid. You don't want your certificate to expire. Those certificates have only a certain duration, a certain validity. You don't want them to expire because otherwise your traffic is going to be invalid, and of course this is very dangerous. You don't want this to happen. This has happened to many enterprises and many firms, so be careful about that. And so if you have the certificates in Key Vault, it's going to be much easier to update it in a central manner. So for the next demo, now that we have a custom domain, we are going to add a certificate on Azure App Service, and we'll see different ways to do that. For this demo, we go into the App Service portal here, and if we scroll down, you will see that under custom domains that we used before, we also have TLS SSL setting. So here I'm going to create a private key certificate. At this time we don't have anything. And for this demo, I'm going to create the app service certificate directly inside the portal because it's easy to do, and also it's included into the app service price. So it's quite convenient to do that. But there are also other ways that you can import a certificate. For example, you can have a certificate centrally managed into Key Vault and import it from there. You can also upload a certificate that you buy externally. We'll do that later. Or you can also import a certificate, another app service certificate that is already existing. So let's go and create the app service managed certificate. This is for tailwindtraders.xyz with a www in front, all right? Now we can create it, and it's going to take just a couple of seconds to be created, but note that it's not applied yet. It's just been created, but it's not terminating our custom domain yet. To do that, first of all, we need to go back into the custom domain dialog, and here you see that we have a link saying add binding. So this is what we will do now. Now in the Dropbox, we see our custom certificate that was just created. We are going to select SNI SSL. It's slightly different from IP-based SSL. In a nutshell, you could say that SNI SSL is allowing you for an unlimited number of domains. IP-based is limited to 10. Of course, there are other differences, but it's a little bit out of scope for this demo. So here I will just use SNI SSL all the time. So let's click on that, and then we can create the SSL binding. This is again going to take just a moment to configure. We see that it's secure now, and now I'm going to turn on HTTPS only. Like this, all the non-secure traffic is going to be automatically redirected to HTTPS. So I can test that. Let's go back into our website. All right, I'm going to enter HTTPS this time. It doesn't work yet because it takes a moment to propagate, but if I refresh after a few seconds, we should see that now the connection is secure, and in fact we can verify the validity of the certificate. So basically the public can do that as well and can also dive a little bit deeper if they want. So that is working fine. But now, of course, you may wonder what's going to happen if I try to enter tailwindtraders.xyz and not www.tailwindtraders.xyz. And I'm going to show you now that you can also configure that, but it's just a little bit different. So how is it working? Let's go back into the app service dialog, and again we are going to add a new custom domain, and this time this is an Apex domain, all right, without the www, without any subdomain. I'm going to validate that. And now we see that just like before, we don't have domain ownership yet, we didn't prove it, and the instructions are slightly different. The main difference here is that instead of using a CNAME record like before, we are going to use an A record. And the other difference is that now we have ASUID, App Service Unique ID, not .www, but directly just an empty one if you want. So let's go and add a record set. It's going to be asuid.tailwindtraders.xyz. The type is going to be a text record, just like before. And now again, we are going to paste the values that we copied from the instructions. We can go and create that. And here for this particular demo, I set the TTL, the time to leave, to 1 hour. It's fine for this demo. It doesn't really play a role here. Now we need to go and copy the IP address, which is the IP of our app service here. And this time we will create an A record. Let's go back to DNS. Let's add here a record, but this time we leave the name empty because that's the apex. And we can copy here, or rather paste, the IP address that we just copied before. So now we have those two new entries which are created. All right. If we go back to our website, we can try now the one that we had before. But first of all, we need, of course, to validate. And now the validation is okay. We can add the custom domain, the Apex custom domain. Let's go and refresh that. And now we see that it is working. It's still not secure. So let's go and add an SSL binding again. And this time the process for the SSL binding is going to be a little bit different because the managed app service that we use for www.tailwindtraders.xyz before can unfortunately not be used for an Apex domain. This is only for subdomains. So instead what we are going to do now is add a binding, but this time we are going to upload a certificate that we purchased from a registrar, from an external registrar. Now of course you could also do that through Azure. But basically the process is very similar. It so happens that I have here a certificate which is already existing, which is a wildcard certificate that we can use for this demo. The certificate comes with a password. And now that I configure everything, I can go and upload this certificate. It's going to just take a moment. And so basically, just to recap, this is an external certificate that I purchased. So now I can choose a wildcard certificate, SNI again, and now I'm configuring the binding. And from this point onward, the traffic is going to be secure for tailwindtraders.xyz and also www.tailwindtraders.xyz. So we can verify that. Let's go back here to our overview. And we see indeed that the record is already registered. We can click on that and we see that now it's working for both the Apex domain as well as for the www subdomain. So this is good. We have basically secured our website. And just to recap, what we did is that we used here some TLS SSL bindings to do that after we declared the custom domain. So basically we are ready to continue with our presentation. For the next demo, we are going to do the same thing. We are going to add a custom domain, but this time on Azure Function, on an Azure Function application, and you're going to see it's very, very similar. So back into the dashboard, we see that we already have a function application set up. And if we go back to it, you will see that it is very, very similar to before. Here we see that it is running right now on functions-tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. And if we want to use a custom domain here, the process is going to be very similar to what we did before with app service. So under custom domain here, we can click there, and then we are going to add a custom domain, and here we are going to use functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. So it is again a subdomain, all right? Let's click on validate. Same thing as before, it's going to fail the validation, and we can resolve that with the same steps. So we are going to set here a text record. Let's go back to our DNS. Let's click on add record. And here, because it's a function subdomain, we are going to use asuid.functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. All right, let's select a text record, and we are going to paste here the values that we copied just before. Let's click that. Done. We can go back to the validation here, and now we are going to set a canonical name, a CNAME record for functions-tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. Let's do that. This is going to be functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. That's a CNAME. And here I'm going to set again the TTL, the time to leave, to 1 second. And we create that record. This is done. All right. So now if we go back to the validation, we are going to see that the validation is passing now. All right, this is here the two records that we set up. Let's go and validate again. This is very fast this time. Perfect. Let's add the custom domain. And as you can see, again, it is very similar to what we did before with app services. So if we refresh, we will have here the domain. Now again, it is not secure at this time, so let's go and add a binding. And since we have this wildcard certificate that we used before, we can actually go and upload the same certificate. Now, one thing which is a little bit annoying when we do that is that we are uploading the same certificate in multiple locations. And of course, it means that if the certificate expires and we need to renew it, then we have to also upload this certificate in multiple locations. And what we can do to solve that is to upload the certificate in Azure Key Vault instead, and then after that to use that certificate instead. Like this, when we need to renew it, you're just going to go into Key Vault and you're going to renew the certificate in a central manner if you want. Okay, so now we are ready to go. The binding is created, and if we go back here to our overview, we see that we have now HTTPS and then functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. Again, it takes a short moment to propagate, so after a short moment we can refresh that, and now we see that the redirection and the certificate are working just fine. And now we will do a custom domain again, but this time for Azure Storage, and as you will see, it's also a little bit different. Okay, so this demo is going to work a little bit differently. We are going to set a custom domain for a storage account. So here I already have a storage account created, and if I go into there, we will see that in the Storage Explorer, we already have a blob container which is set up, and I already have an image inside there. So let's go and copy the URL, and this will be the original address that we want to replace with a custom domain. As you can see, this address is fairly complex. All right, so we are going to replace that with a custom domain, and then we are going to show you also how you can secure that and still serve those images under HTTPS. So in order to do that, we go and find the well-known dialog, which is a custom domain dialog. I'm going to enter here the domain name, and notice that the UI is a little bit different. We have also instructions, but those instructions are different than before. So I'm going to paste here, or rather to type here storage.tailwindtraders.xyz. I'm going to save, and saving is going to trigger a validation, which is going to fail in that case. But don't despair, we have the instructions here, and we know how to create a CNAME record with our DNS provider. So I'm going to copy that and go into the DNS dialog again. And there what I'm going to do is add a new record, and this record is going to be for a CNAME. Now notice that at this point I'm not actually going to create a text record. This is not necessary according to the instructions. So I'm going to copy here the original domain that I want to point my CNAME to. Let's do that. It's going to be a CNAME record. We are going to paste here the alias, and then I can save that. This is creating a new record in the DNS. And here the other instruction is optional. You can select one or the other instruction. So at this point, if I save, it should go through the validation this time. And now we are ready to go and check if this domain is working. So let's go into the Storage Explorer. Note that if I copy the URL of the image here, it's still going to give me the original, the complicated URL, but I can easily modify that to the URL and check if my custom domain is working now. Okay, /images/microsoftazure.png, and the connection is not private, this is correct, but if I decide to continue anyway, we see that the custom domain is resolving properly now. So now the big question is, how can we secure that and continue to serve those images over HTTPS with a secure certificate? And as you will see, the process is going to be a little bit different here. So let's go back to our storage account portal. And here, if I go down a little bit, you will see that under the custom domain menu that we are used to, normally we used to have a TLS SSL domain, but here it is failing at the moment. And so in order to secure the traffic here, what we will do is we will have to set a CDN endpoint. CDN is Content Delivery Network, and this is basically what we can secure with our certificate now. So let's create a new endpoint for our traffic. We are just going to here give it a name, and then after that we select Standard Microsoft Pricing Tier, and we set the CDN endpoint name. Here it could be anything we want as long as it's unique, because anyway nobody is ever going to see this address. So I set that to storage-twt, and then I select here the host name, which is our original address that we want to replace now, and then at this point I can click Create. Alright, so the CDN endpoint is being created, and when it is ready, after a short wait, we are going to be able to secure this CDN endpoint with a certificate, and again you will see that the process is a little bit different from what we did before. So now this host name exists, we can dive into it, and now we are going to add a custom domain to that. Let's do that. So we are going to select here the custom host name, which is going to be securestorage.tailwindtraders.xyz. This box is validating, and as you can see, it is failing the validation, but again, we have some instructions on how to do that. And in order to pass the validation here, we are going to have to create a new DNS record, which is pointing to this original endpoint name. So let's do that into the DNS. Okay, going back into the DNS, I'm going to set a new record, and the name is going to be securestorage.tailwindtraders.xyz. We know from the instructions it has to be a CNAME, and this is the address which nobody will ever see. This is the Azure service address, if you want, which it is going to point to. Alright, so now at this point we can refresh the validation. Now this box is a little bit weird because it doesn't have a validate button, so I'm going to just modify the value, and that's going to trigger the validation again. Alright, it's just taking a few seconds to propagate, but now we see that the validation is complete. Perfect. So now the custom domain name is going to be created for the CDN, and now this is the value that we are going to be able to secure. So let's go back to the overview, let's go back to the custom domain, and as you can see here, the host name has been created, but notice that the custom HTTPS is disabled at this time, and this is what we want to enable. But before we do that, let's go back into our web browser, and we are going to see how this image is looking like if I decide to use my custom domain for the CDN. So that's securestorage.tailwindtraders.xyz. And if I try that, you see that it doesn't work under HTTP, all right, because we have specified that we want HTTPS, and so this is not going to work over HTTP. However, over HTTPS, what's going to happen is that this image is going to be served, but of course, we have the warning that it's not private because the certificate is not valid yet. So we can do that, we can go back into our portal, and this is where we can actually say that we want to use a certificate for that. And this is going to happen here in the Azure portal again. So let's go in custom domain. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to set here configure custom domain HTTPS, and I'm going to use here a CDN manage certificate, which is going to be created by Azure. So like this, I don't need to use my own certificate for this particular feature here. All right, it's going to take a moment to save the changes. And now what's going to happen is that it's going to start a whole propagation, which is going to take a moment to complete. So we can always follow the status here. As you can see, it is submitting the request. And here, because we have a relatively small subset of data and a small CDN, it's going to be quite fast, but it could take minutes to complete in a real-life scenario. And of course, at any time, you can go back to this page and then you can follow what's going on. So now we see that the domain validation is being processed. And of course, this is going to take a while. So here, for this particular demo, we are not going to wait that the whole thing is being processed in order to save time. But basically, if I come back to that in a few minutes, then we will see that the validation has been complete. Everything has worked fine, and now we can serve the images over HTTPS and over the CDN using a custom domain name. All right, so let's talk a little bit about networking strategies. And one thing which is probably true is that in most cases, you want to avoid hard coding IP addresses in your system because IP addresses can change dynamically, so it's probably not a good idea. And basically, at some point, it's probably going to come back and haunt you. And this is why DNS and all those CNAMEs, those redirections, is probably going to be a better idea. Don't forget that on an app service, you can have multiple custom domains. You're going to have also testing, staging if you use some slots. And also you can also use DNS with Azure Storage. And so we saw that in the demo already. You can also have custom domain on CDN, for example, for Azure Storage, like we did before, and also on Azure Functions. So this is a little bit a summary of what we saw if you want. And so let's talk about load balancing now. And so load balancing is kind of a little bit out of the scope of this session, but it has to do with DNS as well. And so we thought that we would show you also an example of how you can set this up in Azure. But of course, there are a lot of different options depending on what you're trying to do. For example, Azure Front Door, we'll talk a little bit about Azure Front Door at the very end of this session. Azure Traffic Manager, which we'll use in a demo, but also things like Application Gateway, Azure Load Balancer, etc. And so depending on what you do, you can choose a different option. Now, we could talk for a very long time, for a whole session or more, about traffic balancing and load balancing. And so if you go to this aka.ms link here, it's going to bring you to a page where those options are discussed in a lot more detail. So we are going to use here in the demo the Azure Traffic Manager, and it's a DNS-based load balancing, so it's going to do a redirection depending on different rules that you set up. And those could be, for example, what is a server which is the closest to the user sending the request. Or it could be just a weighted approach where you say, okay, certain servers are going to handle more traffic than others, etc., etc. And so as you can see, this is for any HTTP address. It's not just for Azure, but here in the demo, we are going to use it to redirect the traffic to app.tailwindtraders.xyz to a single custom domain between 2 or possibly 3, 4, etc. different servers. So let's see a demo for that. So let's go back to the portal, and here we see that we have those 2 app services that we set up. The first one is in Central US, and then the other one is in Europe. And then we have this traffic manager, which we are going to use. And so if we take a look at those 2 applications, we see that those are, again, some very simple HTML. One is showing Central, one is showing Europe. Now, of course, in a normal situation, both websites would show exactly the same content. But here I wanted the content to be different so that we can have the proof that the traffic manager is essentially working. All right. So now if we go back to the traffic manager, we are going to be able to set some endpoints. And so the traffic manager, I already created it in order to gain some time. But if I go to the list of endpoints, we will see that those are empty. So let's go and add a new endpoint. Now this is fairly easy. We have different endpoints that we can use. We are going to add an Azure endpoint, but there are also different endpoints that you can use. For example, external endpoint or a nested endpoint. This can be quite complex and it's a little bit out of the scope of this presentation. So here we want to use an Azure endpoint. We are just going to give it a name and we select App Service. Now, because this is an Azure App Service, immediately we have a choice that we can select. And here we are taking the Central App Service. And we are going to give it a weight of 1. So here we are using an approach which is called round robin or a weighted approach, which means that if everyone has a weight of 1, everyone will get the same probability of answering the request. All right, so now we have added the central endpoint. Let's add another endpoint using exactly the same process for Europe. All right. And as you can see, by default, it's set to 2. If I leave it to 2, it will mean that this particular endpoint will serve twice as much traffic as the other one in a report of 2 to 1. And so I want to change that back to 1 so that both websites have exactly the same probability of serving the traffic. All right, so now we have this endpoint defined. We are going to save it. And then once this is saved, we are going to have to set up the custom domain on the app service. So let's go back to our dashboard, and then we are going to go into the central app service. All right, and now we know the process. We go to custom domain, and you see that we already have here a custom domain which was assigned, and that was done automatically when we created the endpoint in the traffic manager. Now, one thing we need to be careful about is that when we create the CNAME, instead of pointing to central-herointraders.azurewebsites.net like before, we are going to have to point it to this endpoint, to the traffic manager custom, the traffic manager endpoint. All right, so we need to be careful here. So we are going to name this custom domain app.herointraders.xyz, and that's going to be the same custom domain for both endpoints. And just like before, validation fails, it's normal. So we need to add the text record and the CNAME record. And this is where we need to be careful. We need to use here the endpoint, the traffic manager address, and not here the app service address. So that's the place where we need to be a little bit careful. So let's go back to DNS. We know the process by now. We add a new record. We are going to call that ASUID.app, and that's going to be the same one for both. And then we add a text record, which is going to prove that we actually own this domain. All right, let's go. And now if I add a new record set, and this time we are going to add the CNAME, and here this is where I need to be a little bit careful to set the TTL unit, the time to leave, to 1 second, because I don't want the value to be cached. I really want the value every time that the request is received, that the traffic manager needs to evaluate the value and to do basically the full request response path. All right, let's put the alias of the traffic manager end site, and so we see that this is here at trafficmanager.net. We are going to save that, and once this is done, we can go back here and validate. Now the validation is working. We can now click on Add Custom Domain. All right, and once this is done, here we can go and refresh, and then we are going to see that this custom domain is defined. Now let's do the same thing for the European endpoint, all right, for the European version of the site. So let's go to custom domain. And again, it's exactly the same thing, except that this time it's going to go faster because, of course, the validation is going to pass this time because we have already done the work of preparing the validation, creating the text record and everything. So now we can directly click on custom domain, and this is going to add the custom domain to this app service. Now, of course, the last thing we need to do is add the SSL binding, because at the moment the traffic is not going to be secure. And so I'm going to choose here app.herointraders.xyz for the domain. I'm going to upload the same certificate that I used before. It's a wildcard certificate, so it's going to work. And again, as a reminder, if you put your certificate into Key Vault, you don't need to upload it many times. And if you renew the certificate, you don't need to renew it everywhere. You just need to renew it in Key Vault. All right, the rest is exactly the same as before. Perfect. So now we have our Europe site set up. And now, well, surprise, surprise, we need to do the same thing again for the central version of the app service. So let's go here again into custom domains. And now we see the custom domain. We can add the binding, and it's exactly the same as before. We are going to use the same domain, of course, because both run exactly the same. Let's add here the PFX certificate. Let's add the password. We can save. And when this is done, we can configure it just like before. All right, SSL binding is being configured. It takes just a moment. And now basically we have our two sites which are secure and which use the same custom domain. So how is it going to work properly? If I go here and click on app.herointraders.xyz, all right, it's going to open a new window, and in that case, I'm going to get, well, here we go, we get the European version of the website, but of course it could be also the central version. It depends. It really depends on the traffic manager, and now I'm going to here copy the same URL. I'm going to open an in private window so that the session is not saved at all, and now you see that I get the other app service, I get the central version. Like I told you, there are many ways to do load balancing and also many ways on Azure with Azure services. And so another service that is interesting to know is Azure Front Door. Now, we don't have really a lot of time to talk about it, and it's also going to be a little bit out of scope of a DNS discussion. But it's good to know that you have the possibility to do things like that. For example, if you have a path which is /images, then the traffic, you can redirect it to, for example, an image CDN for a storage account. And then if you have /script, then you're going to redirect to another CDN storage specifically for script. And of course, you can do that for different applications and different paths of your application. So again, we don't really have time to go deeper into front door here, but I wanted you to know that this is available, and then you can go back to the AKMS link that you gave us, that we gave us before, in order to learn more. So in review, what did we see in this presentation? First of all, we talked about generic information about DNS and domain name services. And then after that, we saw demos on how to set custom domains in Azure services. And if you remember, we saw app services, we saw function applications, and we saw storage, complete not just for the custom domain, but also for TLS security certificates, so that we could handle secure traffic with HTTPS. Then after that, we did a demo about load balancing using Azure Traffic Manager. And finally, we just said a few words about Azure Front Door. So 2 different ways to handle load balancing and traffic management. All right, so a call to action. It's always good to continue learning. And if you go there to ak.ms/mod40, this is where you will find more information about all that. We have curated a certain number of links for you. I want to thank you so much for your attention in this presentation, and hopefully this answers a lot of questions that you had about DNS.